What's up, DS3 TV? We are back for another video, trying to get the screen back on. But yeah, we're back for another video on the channel, and I can't believe we're 10 subscribers away. Yeah, let's get it. I'm happy, so let's get into the video. Also, yeah, this is Imperial Japan to follow democracy. We have. We always love Kraut on this channel, and this is another recommendation to watch Kraut from one of the fellow subscribers. So yeah, if you want to give me a recommendation on what to react to, you always can, and yeah, just put it down in the comment section down below. You don't have to put the link down, just put like the name and title of the video, and I'll see if I can react to it, and you know, your video will be up probably sometime within the next week. So yeah, let's get into it. And yeah, I forgot to actually start the screen recording. You know, that's fine, it's fine. But yeah, let's get into it and play.
Know Your Enemy Japan is an American propaganda movie from 1945 directed by Frank Capra, made as part of an initiative by various Hollywood directors at the time to support the American war effort. It stands out because it represents something that you have in all likelihood also been affected by. It completely distorts the truth and paints an image
Honestly,
of events that transpired in Japan that is untrue, oversimplified, and promotes a frankly racist.
Completely honest, a lot of history is distorted truth because it's either, I mean, most, like, you know, I don't know if you ever heard about this, like, this saying before, but a lot of people feel like it's three sides. You know, this person's side, another person's side, and then the truth. So usually the truth is somewhat mixed of both people. You know, like both people's grievances and what they did, good and bad. So it can be in the middle, but you know, yeah, definitely. I feel like that we've all been a victim of propaganda to a certain extent, and especially living in the United States of America, you will come across propaganda more than likely, like enough times where you can't even count it anymore, honestly. So you know, you just learn as you keep going, though. So that's all I want to say about that.
Racist agenda. It promotes the idea that war with Japan was unavoidable, that Japan is a nation of vicious savages and blindly obedient robots with no desire of expressing individuality, let alone demanding individual liberties and rights, a racially totalitarian people. And this notion of Japan and the Japanese as a savage and blindly collectivist people who follow and obey has persisted despite being wrong in its totality. Our popular historic understanding of Japan during World War II is built on a myth, a propaganda myth that has distorted our understanding not only of the Japanese, but of Japanese history. The truth, however, couldn't be further away from what is claimed in this old propaganda movie, and even further from the myths that have persisted to this day. Most of us do not know what the truth is. In European and American schools, our education on Imperial Japan is limited, often to the attack on Pearl Harbor and the American island hopping campaigns in the Pacific.
But
We
also,
see images of Japanese
I
soldiers,
remember,
Japanese
like in my
war
AP
crimes,
history
and the
class, we
blindly
learned a lot
obedient
about
masses willingly accept.
like the internment camps that Americans put Japanese Americans in because they were afraid that they would decide to rebel even though they had no reason to. And that was something that was always kind of off to me. And you know, like, and you know, America, like, said, like, oh yeah, Hitler was doing all these bad things, but you enslaved your own people too. You just didn't talk about it as much. You know what I mean? So I kind of see those two. I see America at that time and Germany at that time as two sides of the same coin. It's just that the only difference was they just didn't see themselves as Hitler as much as the rest of the world could have, you know? And that's how I see it, I guess.
Accepting their deaths. Culturally, the image of the grim stare of a samurai and the Japanese as a warlike people resorting to violence as the solution to all problems has been deeply ingrained within our cultural consciousness. But few, though, know about the events that brought Japan into this place, and even fewer seek to find out. Many know of an emperor, militaristic nationalists, the rape of Nanking, kamikaze pilots, the fanatic Japanese soldier, and the apocalypse that brought it all to an end. But few know how the forces that brought an apocalypse upon their own society came to power in Japan. What Japan and Japanese society was like in these days, and how it came to be ruled by a group of fanatics who set the world ablaze. And it is, in all honesty, a shame, because it is a story that is both fascinating and frightening. A story of ideology that shows how a society can be driven into an apocalypse. A story that differentiates itself greatly from the rise of other fascist regimes around the world. A story filled with a valuable lesson for those who seek to preserve their own liberties today. And therefore, this series of videos is not about Pearl Harbor. It is not about the war in the Pacific. This series will focus on Japan before 1941. It will focus on the war in Asia. It will focus on the collapse of Japanese democracy. And it will focus on the rise of Japanese right-wing militarism, with the intention of showing to you how the forces that came to be unleashed on the Western world in December 1941 came into being, and how the lessons to be learned from these events matter even to this very day. The propaganda movies of the 1940s should always be viewed just as that, propaganda. They are intended to paint an image of Japan and its people, and in few cases has such a campaign been as successful as it has been with the demonizing of the Japanese. The image created and pushed on us is one of a Japanese society in the 1920s that is blindly obedient,
almost
uncreative,
all of, like, America's, like, propaganda has actually, I would say it 100% worked. Like, for everything. I don't think it was a time where America's propaganda hadn't worked on anyone. Like, it's honestly, I think America has the most effective propaganda. Because if you think about it, like, even they made movies of, like, how African Americans, how they're not, how they're not, like, how they're lesser and stuff, how we're lesser, and how, like, basically it's just stuff like that, and it's still, like, ingrained to a lot of, like, a lot of people in America's, like, brains and heads, and they pass it down to their kids too. So I mean, it definitely can, though. Honestly, I can see it.
And set on a course for violence and war by an undemocratic leadership descending from old Japanese feudal lords. In reality, though, the 1920s in Japan, known as the Taisho era, is a time period that we barely hear of in our popular history. Contrary to our popular belief, Japan was not an absolute monarchy or military dictatorship. It saw the establishment of a constitutional democracy, whose creators intended for it to be closely modeled after the British parliamentary system. The country was governed under a two-party system, with a liberal and a conservative party, which one could see as almost the mirror of the two-party systems found in various nations of the Anglosphere. The times were set on liberalization and openness. Japanese parliamentary politics had large pacifistic factions amongst its parties. Japan's urban centers had grown to the cultural capitals of Asia, in which a new, modern Asian culture was being formed. Far from the image of militaristic, ordered factory workers, the Japanese cities of the time were filled with nightclubs and theaters, bringing forward artists who attempted to redefine and expand the Japanese cultural horizon, experimenting with with styles and customs of the old Japan in combining it with the new modernity and artistic styles from the West. A new movie industry was building, telling Japan's stories on screen and creating works of a distinctively unique and beautiful cultural blend, putting Japan on the global map as a place of culture that many came to visit and see for themselves. Painters such as Tsurugaru Fuyit merged the traditional Japanese painting style of Kuye with the modern art of Europe, creating paintings that express the experimental and world-open attitude of his time.
Nice and
Far from being a culture of submission, women within the Japanese society of the 1920s, the streets of cities were filled with mogas, or modern girls, as women's magazines were published in a society that had come closer to women's suffrage than many Western European nations. And within 20 years, the parliament had been replaced with de facto military rule. The culture magazines replaced with militaristic propaganda. The cartoons of the 1920s were fighting an American Mickey Mouse. The movie industry now produced war propaganda. The experimental modern art had been replaced with a militaristic realism in the name of utopia. The women who had strived for equality were taught how to charge American soldiers with spears in a final fight to death before dishonor. What happened, and how had it come to this? The answer is not to be found within the Japanese people. There was no cultural, let alone racial drive to undermine what had been built during the 1920s. The Japanese people were not destined to fall into this. Far from it. I believe it is even possible to say that Japan's people were dragged into this against their will and seduced by those who willingly accepted their deaths. Japan at that time had only recently been opened to the world. In 1858, the US Navy forced Japan to open to the outside world, ending 220 years of almost complete isolation. This opening threw Japan into an internal turmoil over the conflict between modernity and the preservation of its own social norms and culture. A conflict that ultimately resulted in civil war in 1868, which ended with the overthrow of the established feudalistic order, the dethroning of the warlords, and the establishment of an imperial system. An imperial system that initially was built like an oligarchy, giving power to the warlords who had been loyal to the emperor. But even as that system became more liberalized, democratic, and open over time, an underlying conflict within Japanese society had not been resolved. The question over modernity and its perceived conflict with Japanese culture. The big losers of the Civil War and modernization were the warlords, nobles and samurai of the once prosperous countryside. As Japan opened its urban centers and rose in importance and wealth, the once wealthy samurai and lords of the feudal era dropped into poverty. For them, the reason for their poverty, which they perceived as a decline of Japan in general, was the modernization that had taken place. And since they saw it as an ill brought upon them by the West, they blamed it on the West. These resentments were often kept quiet, festered in small circles, and were passed down generations. Secret societies such as the Black Ocean Society were formed by former samurai in conflict with modernization. Many now impoverished samurai sent their sons to the Japanese military academies that they perceived as the only career that would provide prospects for their children, consequently raising a generation of military leaders hostile towards democratization, modernization, and the Western world. As Japan entered the Taisho era and drove towards gradual modernization and liberalization of society, it became more democratic and open. The officers educated to lead the Japanese armed forces moved into a different direction that went against the wishes and desires of the Japanese government and its people. Ideological doctrines spread across the ranks of cadets, racial superiority, religious fanaticism, a rejection of democracy, notions of holy wars and global ambitions of conquest and the subjugation of peoples. There was no uniting ideology, no central core of doctrines to which they all agreed upon. Some were Buddhist fanatics, some dreamed of the unity of the Asian race, others believed in the superiority of the Japanese above all others. Some saw themselves as the liberators of Asia. Others believed in a holy race war that they had to fight. Differing groups with differing beliefs, who however were united by only few common notions. They believed in the emperor's divinity and had a common hatred of the government in Tokyo, with its parliament, ministers and representatives. The army, an institution that is supposed to be at the government's disposal and serving the government, started becoming increasingly hostile towards the very existence of that government. And all of these officers were also expansionists and believed that after the annexation of Korea in 1905, that Japan was set to be on a mission to expand further into Asia, be it for conquest colonies or the removal of Western influence. What the various officers may have disagreed upon to be the reasons to go to war, they all nonetheless agreed that an expansionist war and the dismantling of democracy was necessary. And it is these officers who were intoxicated with an ideological hatred of the government they were supposed to obey and with an ideological zeal to expand Japan's borders who were stationed throughout the empire beyond the Japanese Isles, in Korea, in the Kwantung Peninsula of southern Manchuria, and on Japanese concessions in Shanghai, in barracks and garrisons far away from everyday life in urban Japan and any supervision by Tokyo. These officers started plotting, organizing, and dreaming, increasingly seeing themselves as the solution to what they saw as the ills befalling Japan. Ironically, in their search for ideas and ideologies to rid Japan of any Western and liberal influence, many of these officers looked to the West as they traveled to Germany and brought with them a book that was translated into Japanese and widely read amongst the officers of the Japanese army. Der Totale Krieg, or Total War, written by the former head of the German army during the First World War, Erich Ludendorff, who had just joined the National Socialists in Germany. The ideas and theories expressed by Ludendorff focus around...
Those are Nazis. Yes, that's the Nazis, National Socialists. Those were the Nazis. Because I believe it was the National Socialist Party? I think that was the full name of the party, but in German it's spelled differently, so that's why the acronym spelled Nazi. Yeah, but if you didn't know, now you know.
The total mobilization of a nation and its people for war. That the nation's capacity of waging war takes precedence over a nation's politics and the well-being of its people. The army shouldn't serve the nation, but the nation should serve the army, and that a seelische Geschlossenheit, a spiritual unity, is required for a nation to win a war. That a nation must be conditioned, as a whole and by all means necessary, to support a war in material and spirit, no matter by which means that support is achieved. An adherent of Hegel's ideas, Ludendorff believed that war was the ultimate proving ground for a nation to prove its moral, ideological, and racial superiority above all other nations and races. And therefore all must be dedicated to war. A nation's economy, education, infrastructure, entertainment, and culture should be controlled and run by the army, or at the very least, with the intention of putting its support behind all the army's goals. Contrary to popular notions, it was not Japanese translations of Mein Kampf, but of Ludendorff's Totaler Krieg, which found wide reception within the Japanese military hierarchy. The idea of a state dedicated to serve a military in all capacity, to enable the armies to prove the moral, ideological, and racial superiority, gave even further justification to these officers to ignore a Japanese government and public that continued to liberalize. Throughout the 1920s, the disparities in mainland Japan kept growing as urban areas became richer and opened up more towards the liberalization, whilst the peasant farmers of the country descended further into poverty. A disparity that came to its climax in 1929 with the global financial crash. Japan, which had experienced a population explosion throughout the last 30 years, was no longer capable to feed its own population through its own agricultural production, relying on the export of silk and then using the profits made from those sales. Japan had to import rice to feed its population. And with the collapse of silk prices in 1929, the financial crisis brought challenges to Japan's society, which the military officers deemed to be the proof of the decadence and incompetence of the liberal political leadership of a democracy. For the leaders of the Japanese army, the solutions suggested and brought forward by the elected government were insufficient or stood in the way of its own ambitions. Ideas started to brew and spring up within Japanese officers' circles that it might be time to act without government approval, to set the army apart from the government, to take initiative to resolve political and social crises as the leaders of the nation rather than being commanded by the representatives of the nation. The Japanese government attempted to recover from Japan's economic woes of the 1929 crash through austerity measures. The Japanese military insisted that the solution to economic crises would be the exploitation of resources of the Chinese region of Manchuria, that after an annexation would provide the means to not only resolve the problems caused by the financial crash, but a stepping stone into having policy dictated and implemented by the military rather than by the government. In 1928, the 39-year-old Colonel Ishiwara Kanji was given command of a 10,000-men-strong garrison in Manchuria. Manchuria was part of China, under control of Chinese warlords, but the Japanese were permitted by the international community to keep a small troop presence to protect a railroad that was Japanese property, heading from Changchun to Port Arthur to Seoul. Stationed there was also the head of the military intelligence in China for Japan, Itagaki Saishiro. It was General Nagata Tetsuan who had requested that both these officers should be stationed in Kwantung, the southern peninsula of Manchuria that functioned as the base of the Japanese garrison stationed in Manchuria. These three men are a perfect example of the officers that the military had produced throughout the past 30 years. Hostile towards the West, hostile towards democracy, expansionist and believing in the army as a solution to what they perceived as Japan's moral and social decline through modernization. However, in ideology, they all differed. A Buddhist fanatic driven by a sacred religious mission to start a holy race war, which would end the Western global dominance and unite the world under the sacred rule of the emperor. A anti-democrat who wished to implement a plan for total war with the industrialists and Zaibatsu in the war for Japanese global dominance he believed had to happen. And the militarist who wished to build and fuel an armaments industry for a powerful army by annexing the vast iron and coal resources of Manchuria. But all of them believed in Ludendorff's idea of total war and despised what they saw as a Western degeneracy that came with the democratization of Japan. So together they started planning for war and invasion. Nagata, who had deliberately brought the two fanatics Ishiwara and Itagaki to Manchuria to start this war, returned to Tokyo to pretend as if he had no clue what his officers were doing, despite him having set events into motion that would result in a global conflict probably beyond what he had imagined. The three men who started the Second World War.
Together with Itagaki and two other officers, we drew up our battle plans today. In the evening, we will use the soldiers of the railway guard. Our plan to blow up the railroads has to be kept a strict secret from the High Command. No soldier, except for those directly involved, should ever find out. Diary of Ishiwara Kanji.
On the 18th of September 1931, a bomb exploded close to the Japanese-owned railway lines. The Japanese army were quick to accuse Chinese nationalists of planting the bomb and reacted with a full-force invasion of northern Manchuria. The men who prepared and planned this incident organized the planting of the bomb and had in months of preparation gathered the troops and material as well as drawn up the plans for this invasion. They had always denied that it was their intention to start this war, thereby lying to the Japanese people, government and their emperor. Within hours of the invasion's start, the officers commanding the troops received orders from the government in Tokyo demanding from the army to stand down and stop the invasion. The government's orders were ignored. The emperor was upset and opposed the invasion. He denied the sending of reinforcements to support the invading troops, but was bound into a position where he could do nothing to stop the forces that were already there. With the invasion of Manchuria, these three men had lit a spark that would not only begin the Second World War, but had also done what many Japanese officers had dreamed of, to establish the Japanese army as an anti-democratic body, enacting policies despite of the government and not with the government's approval. A day after the invasion of Manchuria, the Chinese government brought a complaint to the League of Nations. The Japanese government offered its support and cooperation with both the League and the Chinese government, but could not admit what must have dawned on the government's ministers in Tokyo by now, that the government no longer had control over its own army. Despite the government ordering its troops in Korea to stand down, the Japanese army in Korea crossed the border to join Ishiwara and Itagaki in their conquest of Manchuria. On the 28th of January, after Chinese civilians assaulted Japanese Buddhist monks in Shanghai, the Japanese troops stationed there started bombing Shanghai and fighting the Chinese troops protecting the parts of the city under Chinese control. After 5 months, Manchuria was conquered and under de facto Japanese military rule. The Japanese government that had opposed this invasion stayed out of the administration of Manchuria, which was left to being ruled exclusively by the Japanese army. The victories of the Japanese army boosted the confidence of the reactionary camps within Japan. The government further lost credibility. The army gained confidence and was celebrated at festivals as Japan fell into a nationalist hysteria and war fever which the army knew to seize for its benefit. The Japanese
pacifist, but she looks
poet
angry.
Akiko,
She
who had
looks
gained fame as a
like that.
pacifist decrying the
Just have to say that. Look at that. She looked like she. If looks can kill, she looked like she was mad.
war with Russia and the conquest of Korea, wrote a poem urging Japan's men to join the army, smash sissified dreams of compromise, and declared that dying at war for the emperor is the purest death a man could possibly wish for. Symbolic for a nation being gripped gradually, but ever more increasingly, by a fever. On the 15th of May 1932, young officers, emboldened by the actions of the Japanese army in China and dismayed of the government's continued refusal to support the army, stormed the residence of the Japanese Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi and murdered him. The incident gained international media attention and showed to the world that the forces that had been unleashed within the Japanese army may very well end Japanese democracy. The trial of the assassins was reduced to a farce, as the accused used the court as a stage to promote their ideology, and the judge was intimidated into passing reduced sentences after threatening letters of support flooded his office. An atmosphere of outdoing was created, in which everyone sought to outdo the other in their fever and support of the military. Within this atmosphere, the moderate and liberal camps retreated into silence, scared of being branded as traitors should they speak up. The violence increased as over the course of the next years, more and more political figures representing the moderate and democratic Japan were murdered by a growing movement of ultranationalists. During the League of Blood incident, politicians and industrialists who had symbolized the modernization and democratic establishment of Japan were murdered by assassins who had again used their trial as a stage. However, the emperor and the nation's nobility were unwilling to have Japan slide into outright military rule. Negotiated by Prince Aonji Kinmoshi, Saito Makoto became Japanese Prime Minister after the assassination of Inukai to try and protect the democratic integrity of the government while governing in a compromise with the ultranationalist military leader General Araki Sadao, who was made Minister of War as part of the compromise. The next 5 years were dominated by a continuous tug-of-war between those two camps and the internal struggles over ideological differences amongst the militarists. In Manchuria, the Japanese army established a protectorate of Manchukuo, a supposedly independent Chinese nation, which however was a smokescreen of fake sovereignty, as Manchuria remained under the rule of the Japanese army, who exploited the nation's resources of coal and iron and its people as slave labor to build a formidable war industry dedicated to fueling Japan's future wars. The Japanese government, however, forced into compromising with the army and its fanatical militarists over which it had lost control, recognized the independence of Manchukuo, resulting in condemnation and isolation by the League of Nations, consequently furthering an idea of isolationism and notions of unavoidable conflict that Japan would have to fight alone against the rest of the world. Manchukuo itself turned into a slave state in service of a military-industrial complex. Big corporations such as Nissan and Mitsubishi located factories there to use the vast iron and coal resources and the Chinese slave labor to fuel the production of a vast Japanese military arsenal. Impoverished Japanese peasants were given land and settled in Manchukuo as colonizers
so
to
they
farm
did it like how
produce
they,
as supplies for the Japanese.
like how
army.
Britain
In Manchuria,
did with,
the Japanese
America.
officers had already...
They just sent their poorest people to America. I don't know if you know this, but yeah, they sent the poorest people to America basically to be colonizers and, kind of look oversee the slaves or whatever. So that's pretty similar.
already established, the very state they wished to enforce over the rest of Japan. Throughout all this, the new Minister of War, Sadao, fueled the flames with propaganda decrying the degeneracy of the West, condemning modern democratic Japan, and promoting notions of a moral and racial superiority of the Japanese. Sadao was part of an ideological faction called the Kodoha that emphasized the importance of a spiritual and immaterial superiority of Japanese morals and culture that was corrupted by and therefore needed to rid itself from democracy and the liberalizing forces of modernity, and to wage war against the most corrupting of all ideologies by invading the Soviet Union. And under control of General Nagata, a system of total national mobilization is implemented. Following the doctrines of Ludendorff's Total War, the Japanese economy was turned into a war economy, dedicated to the arming of the nation's forces and to be in service to the wars that the nation will have to fight. Under Nagata, the army started gradually seizing control of the Japanese economy and economic policies. Nagata followed an ideological faction called the Tosaya, opposed to the Kodoha, believing that some modernization was necessary, but not in a liberal and democratic way, but that the undemocratic general mobilization of Ludendorff's doctrines of total war formed the perfect backbone for a restructuring of Japanese and Asian society for a future war against the United States. These differences in ideology, along the unresolved question of modernization and traditionalism, brought these two militaristic factions into conflict. The emperor remained quiet. With the army having direct access to him and knowing how to influence him, the path was set for a direction undermining the Japanese democracy. Nagata, who attempted to undermine Sadao and his nationalist camp, was murdered in 1935, and his work for general war mobilization continued by Ishiwara. However, despite the powers gradually and undemocratically grabbed by the militarists, they ignored that Japan was still a democracy. The general elections of 1936 strengthened the pacifists in the Japanese parliament and government. And that despite the successes of the militarist nationalists in China, the Liberal Constitutional Democratic Party remained the largest faction in the Japanese parliament, while the Conservative Constitutional Association Party remained the second largest in parliament. Both parties opposed the militarists and advocated for government control over the army and an end to the army's engagement of its own policies. The Japanese people, segments of which may have been gripped by a militaristic nationalist frenzy, still voted for and took part in a political process that opposed those reactionary forces. The political structure of Japan prevented the emergence of a Führer or a Duce, which, should such a role have been established, would have gone to the emperor. But the Japanese emperor was not merely a monarch by God's grace, but a god himself. As such, his position prevented him from engaging in the daily politics that would have come with the ruling of a state. Engaging in earthly politics was considered to be beneath a god, putting the emperor in a position where he as a deity was unable to save those who worshipped him as a god from themselves. On the 26th of February 1936, young officers of the Japanese army who were followers of the Kodoha stormed the government quarters of Tokyo. Ministers such as the Minister of Interior, Saito Makoto, and Minister of Finance, Takahashi Koikiyo, were assassinated together with the closest advisors to the emperor. In the name of the emperor, they proclaimed a military dictatorship and the end of the parliamentary system with all its trappings of modernity. The emperor refused to bend before their demands. The leaders of the coup were surrounded by troops loyal to the government, and Japan almost collapsed into a civil war, both started and fought by anti-democratic nationalists who couldn't agree on which doctrine should be the leading one. The coup was ended after Ishiwara Kanji gave its leaders the choice between suicide and surrender. This action of walking into the government headquarters unarmed and giving the leaders of the coup the ultimatum that ended the coup brought Ishiwara to the peak of his power and national standing. In the end, the factional fights between the militaristic factions and the failed coup of the officers associated with the Kodoha faction didn't bring Ishiwara or the Toisha faction to power. Ishiwara gained national fame for his role in ending the coup and preventing a civil war. But while the army's officers had been squabbling over the past years, another figure had been secretly building power. General Hideki Tojo, a follower of the Kodoha, the leader of the notorious military police Kempitai, had been using his organization as a base to gradually start amassing power in secret throughout not only Japan but the lands occupied by its army. During the coup and its aftermath, it was Tojo and the military police who had organized a purge of all officers in the army who had been connected to the coup. Tojo had no scruples in arresting those and having those executed who may have formerly had shared his ideological ties in the Kodoha camp. The Kodoha and Tuisha factions were united into one movement, with Tojo in a leading position and gaining the reputation of a man who would mediate between both camps, where he gradually kept building power and influence, befriending industrialist leaders, political power brokers, and gaining more and more influence over the state apparat of Manchukuo, until being appointed government minister in Japan by the emperor's advisors, rising to the office of prime minister by 1941. Before Tojo rose to become prime minister, the failed coup that helped advance his career so drastically accelerated the collapse of Japanese democracy. The now united factions of militarists found it easier to push their agendas, even with the non-militarist Fumimaro Konoe as prime minister. In 1938, he passed the National Mobilization Law, which nationalized all labor unions, strategic industries, news media outlets, introduced strict price controls and rationing while giving the army permission to use a completely unregulated and potentially unlimited budget for the war efforts. Ludendorff's doctrine of total war became the law of the land in Japan. Then in 1940, the parties in the Japanese parliament voted to dissolve themselves and to form together the Imperial Rule Assistance Association, the one party for the totalitarian one-party state. An organization that rejected all liberalization and saw itself in service of the army, the cultural and moral superiority of the Japanese race, and the emperor. The last remains of Japanese democracy had been destroyed. The collapse of Japan's democracy and civil society stands as unique. There are many valuable lessons to be learned from it that were unfortunately not taught in our education system. Japan's democracy collapsed because it lost its control over a government institution, namely of the army, showing us the importance of the political independence of government institutions, but also how it is possible to dismantle a democracy through infiltration rather than participation. Another reason for the collapse is also that Japan's ruling liberal elite and government had failed to appreciate the challenges of modernity. It failed to fully understand the ramifications of a radical change to society. It failed to make the rapid and in-depth changes to society comfortable to those who had suffered from them. And crucially, the political forces that dismantled Japanese democracy were not one coherent movement of common doctrines. They were a force split into various differing movements and ideologies who often rivaled and feuded with each other. What however became crucial is that these rival factions of far-right nationalists were able to set aside differences and rally around a common cause when needed to achieve what they all felt was necessary. A movement with internal divisions may appear weak from the outside. However, its ability to rally around a common cause negates that very weakness. In the next video of this series, I intend to show to you in depth the drives and motivations of those officers, to tell you the stories of their ideologies, what they believed in, and what drove them into doing what they did. It is, in popular history, often said that the wars of Imperial Japan and the collapse of Japanese democracy was the result of the financial crash, or at least that is what is often said in history documentaries one may view on TV. I, however, believe that the men who started these wars and guided these historical events were not driven by greed, gold, or capital, but by ideology, intoxicated by doctrines of hate and a fanaticism of which there are few similar in human history. We will in the next video examine their beliefs, their doctrines, the delusions that drove these men into committing crimes and waging wars. If you enjoyed
in all honesty, I would definitely say like Imperial Japan, it kind of seemed like a well, it was in a better, it seemed like a better state of Germany, because Germany, they did go through a depression too, and that's kind of what led Hitler to go into power. But it seems like it was a better time before they went into like totalitarianism, because they had a really good time with a free democracy and just being liberal. But yeah, I can definitely say that this was a very interesting. Yeah, it's gonna be probably a little side cut on that, but as I was saying, like, it was definitely a difference between Japan and Germany, how they ended in a dictatorship, basically, it's kind of different because I mean, Japan in general, you know, they're still like I don't know if people know this, they're still, you know, it's still a monarchy. It's not a democratic. It's not democratic really. Still there. So, even though I do want to go to Japan and stuff like that, but yeah, I know for you know like I know it's not democratic. It's you know it's a monarchy. Um, and you know and the leader has you know basically total control. The emperor has total control there. So yeah, it definitely was a very interesting way to see Japan because I've never seen Japan in that way before. And like how they you know how it kind of felt. I never heard of how like of their rise in democracy and you know in libertarianism and just like you know being kind of liberal. I just never seen it crash. So that was kind of interesting. But yeah, also subscribe to the channel. I want to get 1,000 subscribers by my birthday, September 13th. And thank you guys for 990 subscribers. And yeah, let's get into it. And I mean, let's get into it. Talk to you guys in the next video. Also, I'll probably be streaming sometime. I'll start streaming in like September. I'm getting a new PC, so I'll be streaming in like September, and you know that I'll be doing all of that. Yeah, kind of sucks, but at least I'll have something pretty good that I can use, and it should be a pretty fun time. So yeah, talk to you guys in the next video, and peace.